Welcome to the first day of our symposium. We tell ourselves stories, a symposium on art, politics, and narrative. My name is Chida Masatikin, and I am an alumna of the MFA program in art writing, class of 2017. On behalf of the organizing committee, including myself, thank you so much for coming. As Kaylin and Levi was kind to introduce the general idea of the symposium, I just want to mention some of the questions we will try to answer with the talks, panels, and conversations today. Why do we tell stories about and through art, and for whom? What do these stories convey as evidence? Who has the right to tell them and when? How does this change when the stories of art are written as fiction versus nonfiction, experimental text versus classical essay, the work of community advocacy or political activism versus the practice of objective reportage? What is the relationship between the stories we tell and the realities of history, power, and systemic violence? Today we will start with a talk by the inimitable Lucy Ives, poet, editor, and author, accompanied by Matthew Sinevi. And after a short break, we will have a panel on art and politics featuring Candice Hopkins, Maaza Mengiste, Lina Mounzer, Yasmine El Rashidi, and Adam Shatz, introduced by student Sumaya Tulich, and moderated by student Sahar Khaibani. And for the final part of our evening, we will have Mina Zohal, African-American writer and poet, who will read from her manuscript, Didan wa Najidan and Naranja. I also want to add that we have delicious appetizer and refreshments right behind you. And please feel free to enjoy them with this amazing set of talks and discussions. Also, please join us for welcome drinks after the talks. I also have the privilege to introduce to you our first speaker, writer and poet Lucy Ives. Her novel, Impossible Views of the World, was published by Penguin Press in 2017 and selected as a New York Times Editor's Choice. Her writing has appeared in Art in America, Art Forum, and Vogue, among other publications. For 5 years, she was an editor with the online magazine, Triple Canopy. A graduate of Harvard and the Iowa Writers Workshop, she holds a PhD in comparative literature from NYU. She is currently fellow in residence at NYU's Center for Experimental Humanities and is editing a collection of writings by the artist Madeline Gins. Ives' second novel, Loudermilk or The Real Poet, or The Origin of the World, will be published by Silk Skull Press in 2019, for which personally I am very excited about. She is accompanied today by artist Matthew Sinevi, born and raised in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan in a small town called Gwinn. He graduated from Ferris State University with a Bachelor of Science and played for the men's basketball team. After graduating, he worked as an anesthesia technician for a year before quitting his job to move to New York City in order to pursue a life as an artist. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you for coming today. Please join me in initiating the symposium and welcoming Lucy Ives.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lucy Ives, and it is a pleasure to be here to speak with you. I'm grateful to have been invited. This seems like it will be a wonderful program. The topic of the symposium, art, politics, and narrative, touches on and coincides with many of my own concerns as a writer, and I'm eager to see and hear what will transpire. My talk today is titled Satire and Realism. I'll be attempting to provide some sense of certain concepts and themes I work with. I do want to clarify that this is a gloss and not a polemic. Everything I say is intended to be suggestive, maybe even strange. Do bear in mind that if you attempt to pour water into this vessel, a great deal of it is likely to end up on the floor. Nevertheless, to begin, here is a very brief introduction to my methods. it would not be inaccurate to say that I write with a mirror in hand, but in fact, there is no mirror. A phantom or unreal version of the vaudeville marksman or woman I appear to look away from, what I am aiming at, what I apparently seek to describe. But I am not, in fact, looking away. When I write, I employ a system of mirrors. It is not that they are real mirrors, that you would ever be able to see them in real life, but they entrap images of the world all the same. This is the sort of appliance fiction is for me. I use it to look away from something and still perceive it. I can speak and write about a thing that has been placed directly behind my head. I adjust various reflective surfaces accordingly. They tremble at the ends of wands. The joints are slightly loose. It takes some patience. A scene comes into view. Everything I've just said is a metaphor, of course, but it's one of the best ways I've come up with for describing what it is I want to do with fiction. It's imperfect and provisional, as all metaphors are, and I don't yet fully understand it. Elsewhere, I've called fiction a device for seeing around corners. I recently told someone, fiction is a way of seeing around corners. It's a system of mirrors that isn't designed to catch my own image, but rather images of what I'm not able or permitted to see in my actual life. I'm not exactly sure how it is you can know something that you don't know. But fiction works like that for me. It's a device for collecting information. I think when I said this, I was thinking of an image of a periscope I once saw advertised in the back of a children's magazine. But a text is slightly different from a set of carefully aligned mirrors, and you have to look into it at least twice to see the kind of image I'm talking about. You aren't looking at reality. It's hard not to look at reality, but you have to recognize this and you have to wait until you see the contours of another thing, which is in fact the thing. In fiction, the thing itself is always something that you could not see in life, so-called. This, for me, is the definition of fiction, where it is and how it happens. And in a sense, fiction is not merely or exclusive about making things up, but it isn't not about making things up either. Famously, the late poet John Ashbery composed a long poem, Self-Portrait in a Convex Mirror, about the distortion and indirection of art. As Ashbery notes, the surface of the mirror being convex, the distance increases significantly. You don't have a reliable or even particularly detailed image of the world here. What makes Ashbery's object, a 1524 Parmigianino self-portrait painted on a wooden ball, interesting, is also what makes it inaccurate. The act of taking or making an image is distancing and slightly grotesque. The ball emphasizes this, even as it's a mark of an attempt to imitate the real, actual mirror. The self-portrait is not just a self-portrait, but a picture of what the image looks like in itself. It is a portrait of the image in its poverty and failure to document or express. We observe the simultaneous brief emergence and permanent recession of a humanist soul. Apparently, Renaissance media had its failings too. Anamorphosis, rather than our current difficulty, compression. Elsewhere, there's Lewis Carroll, who famously dealt with mirrors too. Alice ventured into a landscape of extreme language games, sauntering through images of logic, unfettered by the effective distractions of human social life. Alice could enjoy a sort of pure access to the way in which positions form in syntax and with words. Yikes. And there are other mirrors, schemes that go by other names: time travel, dystopia, satire. It's the last of these that has come of particular interest to me, in that satire is a literary mode that has a peculiar and perhaps special relationship with our unique times, for it is not uncommon to hear about the encroaching impossibility of satire. And I decided a little while ago that today I would talk about two ideas or modes or styles of representation that people often consider opposed. Not just satire, but satire and realism. Because I actually understand or know everything I know about fiction through the intersection of these two modes or styles. For me, it's neither satire nor realism, but rather both satire and realism. In order to talk about them, I will need to define them, as well as their interrelation. My definitions and explanation will be imperfect and provisional, just like my metaphor regarding mirrors. But for now, here is what I've got. You cannot satirize events so ridiculous they resist belief, or so people have a tendency to say. The critic Jill Lepore had an interesting take on this difficulty in The New Yorker last summer, writing about recent dystopian novels to point out their dull despair. In her article, she claims, dystopia used to be a fiction of resistance. It's become a fiction of submission, the fiction of an untrusting, lonely, and sullen 21st century, the fiction of fake news and InfoWars, the fiction of helplessness and hopelessness. It cannot imagine a better future, and it doesn't ask anyone to bother to make one. Indeed, we might be tempted to say the same of recent attempts to satirize the present, to imitate it or amplify its effects and contours to humorous and maybe even transformative ends. But what exactly is satire in or of the present? Many seem of the mind that current events are already satire, and I find myself fascinated by this observation. Since satire has traditionally been a genre of invective and, even more importantly, reform, militant irony, and so forth, it's strange that many people would regard ineffective politics, corruption, and increasingly calamitous political situation as satirical, or already satirical in nature. What people seem, in fact, to be talking about is a state in which things have developed, a state which, in better times, would be read as negative impossibility, discussion of high-level subpoenas, and so on. Thus, what they're saying is, we're living in unbelievably bad times, times that feel like a speculative version of reality. I'm not able to process or fathom the present, and therefore must assume that it is a sick joke or dream, in other words, a satirical image of itself. However, instead of saying this slowly and very literally as I've just done, because I'm in an institutional setting and have a captive audience, they simply say that satire is impossible. If satire worked exclusively through distortion, as the above people might feel, the way that we would satirize the present would be to present an unreal or extreme version of it. If the present is already unreal, then we must create an unreal unreality, a sort of double negative, a fake, or double bluff in order to satirize it. In our exclusively distorting version of satire, an actor might portray an actor who portrays a president. Subsequently, this actor portraying an actor portraying a president might himself decide to run for office. Even later, this actor who rose to power portraying an actor portraying a president who is now a politician, maybe a president, might himself be portrayed by a younger comedian with a remarkably elastic face, and so on in a massive trans-historical mise en abîme. Fortunately, at least in my opinion, this is not the only way satire works, which is what people seem to have forgotten in their obsession with the alleged exceptionality of the present. To be clear, etymologically speaking, satire is not related to satyrs, satirica, goat people and their pranks, etc. It has no direct or necessary connection with plain old jokes or caricature per se. Satire is, in a radical sense, a medley. It's a mixture of a number of different things, etymologically a full plate, in Latin a lanx sutura, a dish filled with various kinds of fruits, or a food composed of various ingredients, a mix, maybe a pastiche. Northrop Frye writes, "The word satire is said to come from sutura or hash, and a kind of parody of form seems to run through its traditions, from the mixture of prose and verse in early satire to the jerky cinematic changes in Rabelais. Satire partakes of many registers. It messes with genre. It flouts genre. In fact, satire is a form of social study that examines those aspects of culture that have not yet been admitted to literature and its traditional generic categories. It's a way to bring newness into writing. Satire is not, by nature or definition, a fantasy, a dystopian tale, a series of insults or ironic statements, a mean drawing of a politician, a masked romp with funny voices, a meme. It would be fair, for example, to say that Balzac and even Dostoevsky both wrote satire. They added ideas to the genre of the novel, its conventions of portrayal. More on this, which is the link to realism and the novel, in just a moment. But first, I want to say something more about the present. I think that the rush to call catastrophe already satirical and thus unsatirizable is a species of failure of the imagination. And it's this failure that interests me because it's a failure that specifically rhetorical and even literary in nature, not philosophical or ideological, and it's related to what I see as a long-standing anxiety around description. I know I've used the word imagination here, but what I'm talking about might even be a technical problem related to description in language and the art of imitation, otherwise known as mimesis. Now, please bear with me because I'm going to take us on a little excursus that will bring us to the matter of realism. But it's going to require something of a leap. To begin, in the middle of the 20th century, many Western writers seemed to give up on the idea of the realist novel. Thus, the systems novel was born. Forget, by the way, about modernism, because modernism turns out to be less important in novels than modes of description brought to us by realism and even romanticism. If you're interested in modernism, please look at the poems and paintings and architecture. I think Joyce is a god, but useless to try to convince me that what is unique about Ulysses is its focus on everyday life. The European novel, unlike fine art, had been working this angle forever and was often about phenomena that fail to rise to the level of historical consequence. To go back to the systems novel, in my very quick take, it's a form that emerged out of the seeming impossibility of fathoming the amount of information available, along with the complexity of post-war society, which had, as it still has, not just a present, but also a historical form. The systems novel, finding its popular nadir in 1996's Infinite Jest, which also thematizes the very problem of the fascinating unfathomability of the contemporary moment in a number of plot points involving drugs, technology, and self-maiming, each of which serves as a replacement for love, was a way around the overwhelmed human psyche, a psyche that had previously been a hinge, an engine for late forms of realism that had maintained even within the storm of modernism. The work of Henry James is a great example of this, and the survival of realism in modernist space and time, the hardiness of narrative psychology in novels, though of course James is just rewriting Edgar Allan Poe. We live in times in which, in spite of the ubiquity and the algorithm and data extraction galore, human psychology still exists. Nor is psychology simply reducible to desire. I have a theory that it may actually be this that people are referring to when they say that the present is unsatirizable. In other words, it's not just exclusively Trump, whatever that name now stands for. People aren't quite sure what the role of psychology is anymore in human society, nor are they sure what level forms of experience beyond or outside of computational approximations of reality matter. We find ourselves stuck in a series of unrelatable categories, but I want to reiterate that there is a hunger for caricature in the contention. You can't even satirize what's going on right now. We don't seem to understand that it's caricature we're talking about, not satire. What we mean to say is, you can't even characterize what's going on right now. This matters because satire is still quite possible and possibly necessary. And satire is important not just because it depicts, but because it depicts the way in which categories related to genre function in relation to act's description. So let me switch back quickly to the question of realism and the novel, which is probably my favorite question of all time, because it is a question about description, how you do it and to what ends, as well as how styles of description are related to the depiction of events, of agency and causality. What is realism? I spent many years laboring under the delusion that realism was a kind of novel writing that involved carefully depicting things as they really are, immaterial reality. It's the kind of idea you get when you don't realize that a word is being used to refer to a specific idea rather than a general concept related to how it sounds as if, colloquially speaking, it might be used. I had, of course, confused realism with naturalism, or maybe with something else, an ism that doesn't yet exist. And yet, it wasn't until I went to get a PhD that I started to pick up on the working definitions of realism that are eternally at war in the dwindling territory occupied by literary studies. There is a cliche associated with Balzac's Comédie Humaine, that this series provides a window on the world, and someone with authority whose class I once took insisted to me that realist novels, that great preoccupation of the 19th century on multiple continents, were designed to describe social relations above all else, along with the mutation of agrarianism into capitalist forms of life. However, my favorite definition comes from my friend Christine Smallwood, who informed me that at the beginning of a realist novel, it seems like everyone is just wherever they are, living in some random place and time. But by the end of the novel, it turns out that everyone actually knows one another and are, as they have always been, interdependent as well as ineluctably affected, maybe even determined by this interdependence. This is the narrative innovation of realism, to describe the event as a kind of socially overdetermined node. This is also to say, realist novels have no God. Whatever you may think about Nietzsche, the moment Balzac stopped writing fairy tales was the moment the Abrahamic God, quote unquote, died, if perhaps impermanently. This is also why Victor Hugo, whose Ouija board at one point gave him a direct connection to Jesus, is not, strictly speaking, a realist author. So let us go on. So let us go with this. Realism is a specific kind of idea about where events come from. Realist novels contend that events come from people who are born into history and society, who sometimes behave without consciousness of the meaning or effects of their actions. All this probably seems fairly obvious, but this is also why systems novels are not realist, if we want to split hairs. In the realist novels, events emerge from the confluence of historical, societal, and material factors, but truly it's gossip and commodities along with houses that are stapling the social fabric together. In systems novels, there may be an algorithm at work, by which I mean there is a process not necessarily germane to or intimate with human psychology or intent that causes events. There is a quantifying plan. It may be beyond our control. If we like to believe that events are built from stuff and families and wishes, we are liking things in a realist mode. As credulous readers of the realist novel, we're paranoid and believe in the possibility of tragedy. But also we might want to know about that goose feather that's become attached to the side of an oily bottle in a certain scene in Madame Bovary, a form of news that isn't really news. In other words, attractive and even sensual gossip. If we like the systems mode, our paranoia has crossed a boundary into a form of disinterested connoisseurship of such a complex metafictional form that when for a while no one knew what was going on, there came to be actual living people who believed that Thomas Pynchon was a fun and readable author. I'm joking, but I'm also really not. Anyway, speaking of satire, the other night I did something strange. At a loss after having contemplated Michelle Wolf's performance for a little while, I watched the video of Stephen Colbert's 2006 White House Correspondents' Association dinner speech, during the course of which Colbert at once bends his conservative persona to its most perfect application, while at the same time seeming to step grimly out of character. There are, this is to say, moments at which irony and actuality become perfectly aligned, in which both Colberts speak at once, can employ the same words with different meanings. As Colbert said, "I give people the truth, unfiltered by rational argument." This performance, masterful and steelily conceptual, while also entirely straightforward, seemed to flatten something that was attempting to live its dopey, destructive life in that banquet hall. Maybe it was the 43rd president's face, which was surely flatter and redder than usual. Or perhaps it was that certain distinctions had to be flattened in order that politics continue. The chimeric WMDs had done their damage. Public lying was having a sport of renaissance. It should be noted that the video of those proceedings, made then, now by C-SPAN and with a minimum of cameras, was perfunctory, even less than in 2018, were people envisioning this as a viral stand-up routine. This is the level at which Stephen Colbert crashed the event. He was trolling the networks as well as the cabinet and its president. Note too the weird inset video Colbert had brought with him, as he said, an audition tape. for the position of press secretary. People were not laughing much in the audience, but a laugh track had been inserted into the video in key places, making it all the more unsettling, mechanical, and vaguely horrific in its obvious artifice. There are moments at which it is hard to characterize what you're looking at. I won't play Colbert's speech here, as of course you can't find it online. But watching this 2006 performance, now one is predictably struck by the innocence of those old days, those old crimes, that old decadence. The wars have multiplied and escalated, even as the former president has become internet famous for his vernacular paintings. Stephen Colbert, now thicker and himself redder and forbidden to be weird, plays the real Stephen Colbert on television. The most recent, very recent, Wolfian Correspondence Dinner has been threatened as the nation's last, given a joke made about eye makeup and lying. It's interesting, I happened by pure chance to have watched Michelle Wolf's performance before reading all the commentary about it and thought, this is somewhat similar, at least formally speaking, to Hasan Minhaj's speech last year and Larry Wilmore's speech the year before. Maybe Wolf talked about yarn as pubic hair, but it wasn't a major reimagining of the roast's format. It wasn't, for example, full-on satire. It was a series of smarts, insults, and jokes. It was like a poem or a list. It was good. Yet it remained within the standard form of the roast. It hewed to genre. I thought I'd bring up one thing about 2006, which is interesting given the flurry of attention being paid to Wolf. Colbert experienced a so-called media blackout after his speech, including a deficit of attention from the New York Times. To give you some sense of the upset, Amy Argentsinger and Roxanne Roberts wrote in the Washington Post gossip column, the reviews from the White House Correspondents Association dinner are in the consensus is that President Bush and Bush impersonator Steve Bridges stole Saturday's show, and Comedy Central host Stephen Colbert's cutting satire fell flat because he ignored the cardinal rule of Washington humor. Make fun of yourself, not the other guy. It was the internet that circulated Colbert's formal masterpiece. And I have to say, I think that was what was threatening about what Colbert did, was that he was doing something with mirrors. Many of his jokes were about praising Bush. And it's worth pointing out that Wolf's scariest joke was also, at least one level, a compliment regarding ingenuity of materials. Ingenuity of materials, as she herself wrote on Twitter. And this, I would argue, is a realist mode, as well as a satirical one. With the compliment, true or false, we press upon the node of the social. Compliments are inevitably participatory, and they hold up to us a mirror of what we think, what we value. To say, this is a thing that could be said to be good about you, is to say at once, and in the same breath, here is what people care about these days, as well as, here is how you have attempted to ingratiate yourself toward other people, and even, depending upon the compliment's recipient, here is how you have employed the blindness of contemporary values and persons to your own ends. When satire is realist like this, when realism is satirical, I believe it offers up a form of political hope, even as it scares us a little, threatening us with an abyss that opens up its limits of description begin to show. When I say the limits of description, I'm talking about how difficult it can be to employ words to describe things, and also how difficult it can be for us to admit that a technique for description or ambition to describe has failed, given our love of consensus. Nevertheless, I think it's important to attempt to show the possibility of failure and people's anxiety about that. Let me put this another way that perhaps won't seem so negative. It might, in other words, still be possible to see the event as a product of social life, as a product of the works of human actors. Let me say this again. It might still be possible to see the event as a product of social life, as a product of the works of human actors. And as I said earlier, in fiction, the thing itself is always something that you could not see in life, so-called. Anyway, it is the possibility of the non-inevitability of events upon which the possibility of politics is founded. And I happen to think that fiction, and in particular the novel, as a site of satire and of realism, as a work of complex description, it is a great reminder to us of this non-inevitability. Thank you. This was by design. It was supposed to catch your attention, which I think it did, perhaps. Even for me, I just met Lucy less than 72 hours ago or so. Just kind of met through acquaintances, and I think that it plays to what she's trying to get across in her book very well, as using me almost as a mirror to project something onto you as an audience. And she's kind of letting me take my own spin on things, because no matter, if one of you were to come up here and cold read this essay, whatever you would like to call it, a speech, everyone's going to take something different from it and present it in a different manner, which I think keeps it real and authentic, which I also think is important. I'm studying to be an actor. I'm an actor, and that's essentially what acting is all about, is being authentic. So we wanted to keep this as authentic as possible, and maybe even a little weird and uncomfortable. As you can see, she's been staring at me this entire time without saying a word. But I think it makes for, even if you think it's just crazy, it still catches your attention, which I think is what art is all about, whether it's writing or painting or whatever. Yeah. Am I using a system of mirrors, or am I telling the truth?
Yes, that's my question.
That's the truth.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, I went to school, and I had actually planned to go to medical school, and I worked for a year in my local hospital. I was kind of prepping for medical school, and I still have a passion for medicine, but I realized that it wasn't what I wanted to do with my life. So I didn't know anybody out in New York. I basically had one acquaintance that I packed up my stuff, I sold my car, and I moved out here to live as an artist. So here I am. I think that utopia is that events are not inevitable, that there is a time frame in which that we can affect the future. We can kind of steer our destiny, so to speak. And if I were to interject as well, I think that I would agree with that, as well as just, I think that's a nice way of putting it. Scratch that.